It's the third writing session on the String Quartet adaptation, and I've had a few days to think about where I wanted to go with the piece, and this idea of using something called suspensions came up. I think it'll be a good way to convey an idea that I have. So let's look at what a suspension is first, and then we'll talk about it. If I were to play a simple 1-5-1 progression, I could choose to suspend one of the notes from the first chord into the second chord and then resolve it. So in this case, I'm going to take this C, the top note, and I'm going to prepare it by playing it as a chord tone in the first chord. Then I'm going to play the second harmony, and I'm going to suspend it into that second harmony. Then I'm going to resolve it down to a chord tone. So once again, prepare it, play it as a chord tone, suspend it, and then resolve it. So that's what a suspension is. In this particular case, it's called a 4-3 suspension because the C becomes the fourth of the G chord, resolving down to the 3, its third, the B. So simply a 4-3 suspension. Now, how is this going to work on these more unusual harmonies that I have in this piece? That's something I'm interested to try. But what's more important really to me is what the suspension represents. And that's that when we adapt, when we change, we carry things from the past into the future, and then we have to resolve them. We have to make them work. So in this case, the C becomes dissonant on the G chord, but then it resolves and becomes harmonious with the G chord. And that's a lot of how I think adaptation and evolution works. We come across something that is difficult, and we're trying to use information and ideas from the past, but they're not quite working, and we have to decide how to make them work. So that's the idea of these suspensions. I'm going to go ahead and write a progression using the harmonies that I have and using this idea of suspensions, and then we'll come back and take a look at it. I've got this section using suspensions completed. I think we should just take a listen to it first. It's going to seem very complicated, but if we break it down step by step, I think it's going to make more sense. So let's just take a listen first. All right, let's look at the steps that it took to get to that point. So here in step 1, all I did basically was take a chord progression that I've already used before. And step 2, what I'm doing is I'm extending that chord progression. It was only 4 bars long, so I'm taking each chord and making it twice as long. In step 3, I've made it longer still by repeating the chord progression, as I did when I used this same progression earlier. Now let's look at step 4. In step 4, I decided that I wanted the second half of this phrase to be in a higher register. And I achieved that by leaping here in bar 7 from this A up to this F, and then playing the F again on the last chord of the sequence of chords. And this would be considered a sharp 11 on the B chord, a really pretty sound that I really like. After I did that, I was thinking, okay, well, I'll just go back to the F sharp and play the sequence again. And I thought, no, I really want to modulate somewhere here. So let me show you what I did. I'll get you over here so we can see it. On this B chord here, we've got the F in the melody. Now, normally we would have gone back to F sharp, but I decided that we could get some sort of fresh new sound if instead of going there, we went to the F chord. And I did what's called, or what I'm going to consider here, a common tone modulation. So we have this F on top, and then we go to the F chord with the F on top. And it's a very smooth transition. Now, is that exactly a common tone modulation? Well, the F on the B chord is the sharp 11, so not a chord tone. I guess you could say that technically it's not a common tone modulation, but it sounds like one, it functions like one, so that's what I consider it. Let's go on to step number 5, because that's where we start adding the suspensions. Now you'll see I've labeled P, S, and R, standing for our prepare, suspend, and resolve. And you'll see that throughout this section. Prepare, suspend, resolve, and so on. Here, you can see I've prepared an F sharp on the F sharp over A sharp chord, and then I've suspended it into the C chord, and then I've resolved it in the C chord. Here, I prepared an E natural on the C chord, then I've suspended it into the A flat chord, and then I've resolved it. So let's just listen to those two examples of suspensions and see how that sounds. You can see that even those two suspensions added quite a bit of interest to the chord progression. Now, why did I pick those certain notes to suspend? Well, that just comes down to a matter of taste. Let's listen to the whole of step 5, and you can watch the markings of P, S, and R go by and hear those preparations, those suspensions, those resolutions, and see how that all works. Those suspensions added so much, and I really think that sounds quite beautiful. You might have noticed that there are a couple spots where there's more than one suspension happening at the same time as here. We have two suspensions, two resolves, two preparations happening concurrently. This is called a double suspension. You can see here I've prepared this E flat, which is the fifth of the A flat 7 chord, and we've resolved it to the root of the E chord, going up from E flat to E. Here we've suspended the C, which is the third of our A flat 7 chord, and we've resolved it down to the B, which is the fifth of our E chord. So we've got two suspensions resolving in two different directions happening at the same time. Again, that's simply called a double suspension. Now let's look at step 6. That's where we really start to add some of the moving lines into this piece. So you're probably thinking these lines look pretty familiar, and they should be. If we look at the shared lines between the viola and the second violin, you can see that we have this in the viola, and then that continues into the second violin. So what is that? Well, it's our basic line, but with some slight modifications so that it'll work over our F sharp chord. So if you look at the tensions that we're playing, first we're playing the root, the F sharp in the viola, then we go to the A sharp, still a chord tone, then we're going to play the add 2 or the 9 when we play the G sharp, and then that Lydian sound that we like, the C, and then we continue it on in the second violin with the third of the chord, the fifth of the chord, that sharp 11 again, and then the 13th or the major 6. So we have that nice shared line there. Let's just hear that. So you can see we're starting to add some motion into this part. If we continue on, We've got another cell that we've used in the past, worked slightly differently for the viola, and then mirrored here in the cello. We talked about how the time was marked relentless, and I'm adding these melody fragments to keep momentum happening. The suspensions are fantastic and they add a lot, but half notes and whole notes really put the brakes on here. So we're adding in all these pieces to just keep that flow happening. Let's look at another one. Here we have the B major chord, and over it I've played this. Now you see most of those notes are from the whole tone scale that we referenced earlier, all the notes except for the D flat at the end of the measure. Let's hear that together. It works quite nicely. Before, where we were showing conflict between the two parts, now we're showing this cooperation, where we're taking two different sounds, playing them together, and they're working quite beautifully. I think this really helps cement this idea of adaptation, where we're adapting one thing to work well with another. So let's hear all of this final step 6 and see how these lines weave through the harmony and propel the motion of the piece. I'm very pleased with how that came out. Thank you to everyone who's coming along on this journey with me, and I'll see you next time.